God on the Move.
When it becomes politicized, when it becomes, oh, that's a fake thing, it's a hoax. When did Christianity become anti-science? And after this person of faith, I usually have to sit down, particularly students that ask me questions about science, and I always say, like, there is no conflict between science and our faith.
Trinidad and Tobago is a Caribbean nation whose history, culture and development have been deeply influenced by the intercontinental slave trade. During the colonial era, thousands of enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the islands to work on plantations, shaping the region's demographic and cultural landscape. Today, the Caribbean faces another major challenge, the climate crisis, which threatens coastal communities, ecosystems and economic stability. Rising sea levels, changing weather patterns, and increased vulnerability to natural disasters like hurricanes are placing growing pressure on the region. You are listening to the God on the Move podcast. This Lausanne movement production is part of a wider initiative dedicated to sharing testimonies of God's work across the world for every believer. And this is a story about the consequences of and the connection between slavery and the climate crisis in the Caribbean. The voice you heard earlier is Dr. Keron Niles. He is a servant of Christ, and this is his story.
I am from the Caribbean, and I think that's a good start. I am from a twin island republic called Trinidad and Tobago. I am a music manager and I'm an academic. I guess in university circles, it would be a big deal. And I guess if you see it in the media, it would be called tenured. I'm a tenured university lecturer at the University of West Indies. I specialize in research related to what lies at the intersection of climate and energy policy. But I have, perhaps unsurprisingly, a deep interest in what lies at the intersection of climate change and culture as well. So one of the things that led me down this road was I authored a paper, which is available online on my website, KeronNiles.com, on climate change and slavery, where I did research to show the direct link between the enslavement of millions of Africans in the Caribbean and climate change. And so what I was showing is that when Europeans arrived in the Caribbean at the end of the 15th century, so that would be 1492 was when they got there, they met people who were subsistence farmers. The indigenous persons were growing crops for their families. But the Europeans came and they needed to make a return on the investment. And so they started looking for gold. They forced the local inhabitants to help them look for gold. Many of them died. They also forced many of them to convert to Catholicism. Stories about people being burned in pots were not uncommon during that era. But they did something else. They decided to force them into plantations to grow crops for Europeans. What that meant is that those indigenous inhabitants went from subsistence farming for themselves to export-oriented commercial agriculture for a metropolitan country that they never seen, never heard of, and certainly never been to. That meant that the system that was in place to secure that outcome, or that had to be put in place rather to secure that outcome, resulted in the deaths of 95% of our indigenous population. Because commercial agriculture, and certainly export-oriented commercial agriculture, is a far cry from your backyard garden. You can plant the trees when you want to. You can choose not to water them. You can be grateful for the rain. But when you are doing it as a product that people need to buy, on that scale, for millions of people, you need a system where there is not that much rest and you have to meet certain quotas. So in this region, they grew cotton, and in this region, they grew sugar cane, which is probably the staple crop that most people are familiar with. We grew it for a couple of centuries, throughout the British West Indies in particular, but also in the Dutch West Indies, Curaçao, Aruba, and even in the Spanish West Indies and the French West Indies as well at the time. A lot of the emphasis ended up being on sugar cane, and many people died. But the real reason why they had to use labor in the way that they did was because labor was just a factor of production. They needed the energy that the labor would provide, essentially. So what I was able to show was slavery eventually ended because they need that system of forced labor. And of course, it was free to them, not free to the people. Millions died. But what I was able to show was, and this is also shown in a book called Capitalism and Slavery for those that are interested. It was written by the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams. I was able to kind of show directly that slavery ended in large part, as there's this kind of already when established, is not the only reason. Humanitarian efforts by persons like Wilberforce is certainly important, necessary, and helpful. But machines don't revolt. They don't strike. They don't refuse to work. They don't pretend to be sick. Humans do all those things. And machines are simply more efficient, far more efficient. They could do more work for longer periods. And the only thing you need to feed them was a bit of coal as an energy source. So the industrialist that was in the House of Commons was able to kind of trace the arguments of politicians to kind of show that persons with industrial interest were making the point that, listen, we don't actually need slaves anymore in this way. Because what was happening is that the Industrial Revolution created a technology that made the slaves, or slave labor, it made it become viewed as less efficient. And so I was able to show in this research, climate change and slavery, that, okay, so they were able to go from enslaving the local inhabitants for this mass production to industrialization and the use of machines fed by coal instead of this. So in some ways, technology saved the day in some ways. In some ways, the transition to the Industrial Revolution helped to end slavery in a very meaningful way. However, feeding those machines coal and transitioning to the Industrial Revolution in that way meant that we solved one problem and inadvertently created another. So when you track the emissions from Great Britain, for example, from the end of slavery, let's say the record started in 1850s, slavery ended in 1838. You can actually see it when you begin to see the Industrial Revolution take off. You'll also see the use of coal take off, and you see the carbon emissions from industrial Europe skyrocket. And so what was interesting to map in my research was looking at the tragedy that the same group of people that was subject to slavery now find themselves subject to the impacts of climate change. Same people, particularly of small island developing states in the Caribbean. You first have a legacy of slavery to deal with, and now you have an onslaught of multiple hurricanes a year that are getting more frequent and more intense. And those two things are very linked. It's just a system of production. You need an energy supply. You need the factors of production to power export-oriented economies. So you started with humans and a system of slavery, and you transition to machines powered by coal. One resulted in the deaths of millions via enslavement. The next one resulted in climate change, which is an ongoing battle. This is important because it squares onto something, or it kind of showcases a concept called the tragedy of the commons, which is this, right? The tragedy of the commons says that if a group of people are using a resource, let's say there is a pond in your village. It's a famous example. A pond in your village, and they're fishing that pond. But everybody keeps fishing every day, and the fish begin to become scarce. The tragedy of the commons says that even if everybody knows that it will deplete the fish in the pond, no one will stop because they don't want to be the one that stops while everybody else benefits. Especially if you stopping doesn't stop anyone else. Why stop? You're just going to watch your neighbors eat fish and your family potentially starve. And that's the deal with overfishing. That's the deal with oil and gas production. A lot of work has gone into mapping the impacts of fossil fuel production on the environment. But the fact of the matter is, if any one company or one country stops, no one else is bound to stop, and you're going to have to watch your neighbors make lots of money, which is exactly what happened in the case of one British company, one British multinational that said that they were going to transition to a gas economy. Then they had lots of presentations on powering the world's gas economy, and so they transitioned to gas, also because gas is the cleanest fossil fuel. And then things that they couldn't foresee happened. Like Russia invaded Ukraine. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, oil and gas prices skyrocketed. And they watched their fellow oil companies make supernormal profits, windfall profits. And they weren't in a position to capitalize because they had transitioned to gas. I'm talking about BP, by the way. It's public knowledge. And so they've since done a 180 to really intend to get back in the game. Because if they had not made that transition, they would have benefited both from the situation in Ukraine and from what's happening in Iran. Now, and call it what you must, or call it whatever you want to, this is directly actually us benefiting from something, not just something that we know is damaging to the planet, but we're literally benefiting from tragedies. So I ask my students all the time, if the immorality of slavery did not stop people from selling people, what makes you think that a climate crisis that isn't really impacting everybody right now, what makes you think that that's going to stop people from selling a chemical? The tragedy of the commons is a really simple phenomenon. If you withdrawing doesn't stop it, you're not going to just watch your colleagues benefit. So the tragedy of the commons was a play in slavery. And it was clear, the MP for Liverpool, I read the Hansard, was saying to his colleagues, asking for the end of slavery, why do you hate England? Why do you hate the people of Liverpool? Because they were a port city. So do you just want France to benefit? Because that's what's going to happen. France is just going to make a lot of money and the British Empire will die. So today you will hear persons talking about the amount of jobs being provided by the oil and gas sector, drill baby drill. The more that we change, the more things remain the same. And there's a deep injustice in all of this. Something that connects all of this that really speaks to me, particularly as a person of faith, as a Christian, in terms of there is an opportunity here to make lots of money. For context, I did my master's degree in international law, with specialization in oil and gas law. And I could have really doubled down. I had the opportunity to become an oil and gas lawyer in Europe. I still think back on that day, actually, sometimes saying to myself, I would have been very comfortable. Like, it would have been a nice life. But there's something in my soul that just says, like, I just can't do it. I just can't devote my life to something that I know is going to not just be the detriment to the planet, but the very people from the places that I come from.
Before we continue with the story, I want to let you know that you can now join the God on the Move community on the Lausanne Action Hub. Be part of the conversation, see exclusive content and share your own testimony. You can find the link to join the community in the podcast description. Also, if you have a story to share or know someone who might have, please contact us at podcast@lausanne.org. That is podcast@lausanne.org.
And so I think one of the things that I think about as a person of faith is, what does this mean across the planet? When it becomes politicized, when it becomes, oh, that's a fake thing, it's a hoax. When did Christianity become anti-science? And as a person of faith, I usually have to sit down, particularly with students that ask me questions about science. And I always say, like, there is no conflict between science and our faith, as far as I can see it. I haven't seen any conflict yet. The conflict that I hear about and I see is usually contrived in the media and usually for a specific purpose. I mean, I'll say it right here and then we could fully conversation amongst your listeners. The two things serve two different purposes. And a great example is, of course, and I think C.S. Lewis made the same point, if I bake a cake, scientists can come and pull apart the cake and they can tell me, despite examining the ingredients, putting it under a microscope, they can tell me what the chemicals it was made out of and possibly how it was made and the process that I used to make it. Because that's the point of science. It answers the question, like, how? How do you do this? But no scientist would ever be able to tell you why I made the cake. And that's the purpose of faith. Why are we here? And so there's no conflict. And as the church, I feel like we need to return to a point, and beyond even church, as people, we need to return to being a people that don't just strive for justice within our own families and communities, but see justice in the world as part of our core, as part of an extension of the hands and feet of Jesus, and don't view science as a threat to our faith or a threat to God. Like, God isn't threatened by science at all. And so that's one major part of my life. And I'll pause there. The other part is related to music, of course, but I'll pause there for now.
As so often, this extensive introduction opens so many cans of worms, raised questions and hit on topics that I didn't even know where to pick up the conversation. We talked for a while about the tensions around dealing with the climate crisis. On the one hand, you have people, companies and countries who deflect and say, well, nothing changes if only I change. I'm only a small cog in a big machine, so I won't start the change. On the other hand, there are at least some countries and regions that seem to care deeply about change, but in many cases export more of their carbon footprint rather than actually reducing it. One example is mining for raw materials that are needed for batteries for electric vehicles.
This, by the way, that's when I give talks on this topic at universities, that's the next dimension that I mentioned and probably will have to investigate soon as an extension of my work as well, is when we're trying to transition to avoid catastrophic climate change, what are we transitioning to? And so you transition to technologies that require things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, like rare earth metals, and you can see how it's already causing global conflict and the deaths of thousands and the enslavement of even more people. I looked at this in there's something called the Lithium Triangle in Latin America, and I remember visiting there a number of years ago. And by number, I mean maybe 6 years ago, visiting one of the countries. And the presenter who was talking about the Lithium Triangle, he's just like, they're just struggling to cope with the amount of illegal mines and the amount of people enslaved, and particularly women working as slaves in these mines. And I was saying, this is the same planet. I was just like, I can't believe that we're still talking about slaves in a post-2000 world. It's insane. So it's like we transitioning from slavery got you climate change. And now transitioning from climate change just seems to be getting you slavery again. What's happening? What is happening in this equation?
This reminded me of a narrative that I often hear and that confuses me frequently. It's the story that the West, or sometimes more precisely the British Empire, ended slavery. But as a matter of fact, slavery was never abolished. The transatlantic slave trade ended, of course, and that is to be celebrated without a doubt. But to state that anyone abolished slavery is just not true. There are more slaves than ever before. They are just in other parts of the world, and or are connected to different sectors.
Just so your listeners know just how insidious this actually, when you kind of really drill deeply. To be clear, you'll also hear British politicians saying that you're paid slaves compensation at the end of slavery, which is probably one of the most insidious lies that is very annoying for persons from the Caribbean to hear a politician claim. So at the end of slavery, well, if you can call it that, in 1838, what happened was they compensated the plantation owners for the loss of their property. Not a single cent was sent or given to the slaves themselves at all. So just to make sure that we are clear on just why this is a live issue, and just to know why this is important, the amount of money that you are paid was to plantation owners to compensate them for the loss of their property was, I think it was as much as 25% of the entire treasury. It was a humongous amount that was a loan that was only repaid in 2015. This is from 1838 and was fully repaid in 2015. So we're not talking about a small amount of money. But what happened on that day was when you are finished repaying the money, Her Majesty's Treasury actually posted on Twitter that the taxpayers of Britain helped to end slavery. And that was not well received in the Caribbean at all. I'm actually reading from what they tweeted. They said, here's today's surprising Friday fact. Millions of you helped to end the slave trade through your taxes. Did you know in 1833, Britain used £20 million, 40% of its national budget, that's just to be corrected. This is from Her Majesty's Treasury, 40% of its national budget to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The amount of money borrowed for Slavery Abolition Act was so large that it wasn't paid off until 2015, which means that British citizens helped to pay to end the slave trade by paying off your own plantation owners that were the ones enslaving people. Just when you think about the injustice of what that is like, because it's not just, let's be clear, it's not just slavery. It's a system of treatment of people. So even after slavery ended, people aren't viewed as equal bearers of the image of God. They're viewed as black and inferior. And that system still persists. And it really was, segregation ended late. That system persisted for many, many more years. So I think the question is, how should the church, how should followers of Jesus respond? That's the question. The Anglican Church, they actually had an independent commission appointed to investigate how their church benefited from slavery. And so I give that to the Anglican Church, the Church of England. That was at least a noble exercise because the Church of England actively invested in slavery, which is what they found. They didn't just condone it, they were active participants in the enslavement of African people. And in their conference, I got an email saying, we had a conference about the findings and your paper was mentioned. And I was just like, whoa. I was just like, okay. I was really happy, not just that they mentioned my paper. I was happy that they mentioned the paper because it meant that someone read it. But but more importantly, they actually have a real conversation as the Church of England about, we have some historical responsibility for what happened. And that's important because now that we have climate change going on, it's the Church of England that's selling land to the government of Kiribati so that they can move their people to Fiji when it's no longer inhabitable. Right? And so the government of Kiribati is now has paid millions to Church of England so that they can move their people to Fiji. We have serious questions that we need to interrogate as people of faith about what's happening in the church, right? But also, regardless of denomination, you need to think about, and I think this is really, really important because as a person of African descent, a lot of people in the region, like one of the persons I was confronted with was like, how can you share the faith of the enslavers? And I don't know if I do share the faith of the enslavers. I share a story of being saved by the God of the universe. And if they worshipped the same God, then great. But I'm not even sure if they did. Maybe they did. But here's the interesting thing. Maybe they did. And the same blind spot we have for climate change today, in terms of it not being that big of a deal and that's being blown out of proportion, maybe they thought the same way about slavery. Maybe I can give them that benefit of the doubt, because when something is not in your face, it's hard for you to believe what it is or the impact. And just to give two very live examples of this, the worst treatment of Africans is happening in the Caribbean, in the punishing sun for hours without rest. People were in Europe when this was happening, and it took organizations like the London Missionary Society to actually really begin to take action with, guys, this is really, really bad. But people were just carrying about their lives, trying to feed their families in the UK, and they're just hearing these stories, and who do you believe? In Germany, the Jewish population weren't being executed in the public square. It was away from major population centers, and many Germans were just like, this isn't happening. You're blowing this out of proportion. And again, with climate change now, we're saying, yo, this is bad. If you come to the Caribbean, it's getting worse. We're losing heritage, which is one of the things I'm measuring now. The loss of heritage due to hurricanes and climate impacts. We're losing heritage. We're losing lives. We're losing parts of our island. And some islands, some countries will be lost altogether. Some islands will be lost altogether. But it's far. It's not in front of your face. Tuvalu might be lost altogether, but how many people even know that Tuvalu exists? If it's not in front of your face, it's hard for you to care. But whose job is it to bring this to your attention? As persons of faith, do we feel a bit of responsibility to be like, actually, I should pay attention to this? Let me see for myself what's going on, because those people are image bearers of God. Like, how do we process this information?
I think this is an important question each of us has to answer for oneself sooner or later. But his comment made me curious. How does Keron work this out practically as a Christian academic? Not only in his research, but in his life.
So to me, it's one contiguous piece of work. I think that for me, faith has a way of grounding me. And I don't try to preach to my students ever, but I'm also asked about faith because students have really good reasons to be very critical of faith, right? And I encourage that. I encourage them to put it apart. Like, listen, be extremely critical. Ask questions. Ask as many questions as possible. My role as an academic is to ask hard questions, like what's happening in Greenland when Trump wanting it. Part of that is also an oil issue. And part of the reason that the oil is even available is because of climate change. The same thing with Alaska. Once polar ice caps start melting, what's under the ice becomes more accessible. And one of the things that's under the ice of the Arctic is oil. And so I get to ask these questions to students all the time about what does this mean in terms of justice? What does it mean in terms of these things? Does your belief system get impacted at all? Or is it just that oil equals energy, energy equals development, or oil equals money, and money equals wealth? Or like how do you do this? And so in my actual work as an academic, one of the things that I am really interested in has been, so Nancy Pierce has this book I've been reading it for a while called Total Truth. And it's this, I'm a whole person all of the time. I'm not a Christian sometimes and an academic the other times. I'm a Christian who's an academic. And I have to be that all the time. And I'm happy to take questions. I mean, there's some people who get upset just to the idea of faith. But I'm really happy to take questions. And I think it puts me in a position to engage, particularly in very anti-faith environment, where people are very skeptical of the role of faith. And for good reason. I get to go in the room. I get to be in the room and just listen to them. And sometimes my heart breaks because a lot of what they say is actually not wrong. You know, they have just reason to be upset when you just look at the facts. But also, I think it's really important to separate the things that have been done in the name of human greed and human ambition from the heart of God, as revealed in Scripture. So I feel that's a lot of what I do in terms of just being in the room, being able to have the conversation and really pushing. One of the things that we did with Denise, we got to have a conversation about justice issues on the logos on a boat. And we got to have a panel about what do we think about justice. And so there is the work again. I'm actually referencing the Catholic Church quite a bit here today. It's weird. Well, I'm referencing both the Church of England and the Catholic Church, to be fair. But there was a Catholic priest called Gustavo Gutierrez who wrote on the theology of liberation, otherwise known as liberation theology. And as Christians, particularly if you're an academic, I feel like you have a kind of responsibility to extend his work and to interrogate it, because God really did come so that we can live and live abundantly. He really did come so that we can be free. And not just Europeans and wealthy persons across the world, wealthy persons from India, because of course India has more millionaires than anyone else in the world right now. You know, it's not just for the wealthy, it's not just for the well off. He came to set people free that are currently enslaved on lithium mines in Latin America. He came for everyone's freedom. what does that mean in 2026, you know?
Of course, we cannot even think about ending this podcast without asking the question of all questions. Where do you see God on the move, in and through you, your ministry, or the wider context that you're in?
So we might have to have a part two to really dig into that one. And there's a longer story relating to me nearly dying last year, coming very, very close to death last year, and going to speak at a conference without the full use of my facial muscles because half of my face was paralyzed. Part two. There is that part of the story that was very tangible in terms of I really felt that what had happened was an opportunity for me to really speak. And I really think that God used that powerfully. And I think he still wants to use that. So I have every intention of getting out to the way so he can do what he wants to do. The other thing the example I can give that's probably shorter is, and see how quick I can do this. Number one, an example, when I was serving as a pastor in New Zealand at the time when I was living there. And somebody came up to me and they said, they don't think they can serve on the worship team anymore. They don't think that they're worthy. They need to step down immediately. I said, you're not worthy? Like, what does that mean? It's a very strange thing to say. And they said, well, they slept with someone last night. And I just said, oh, I understand what you mean. And then they said, I slept with someone of the same sex. I was like, okay, now I understand what you're saying. I said, well, you've told me this exactly 5 minutes before the start of church. I literally have to be on stage in 5 minutes. I know that I don't have the full answers to your experience and what you're going through, but I can hear the pain in your voice. And I know that the solution to what you're going through right now lies in the God that we're about to serve. So let's go put what you're going through before him and let's come back to this. I'm not saying that, let's not belittle this, let's not minimize it. It is an issue. It's important for us to talk about this, really important. But let's not overestimate our ability to find a solution, which is the creator of the universe. That's example number one. Example number two is there have been a couple of times where students have just been like, it doesn't make any sense. They felt like they had to choose between evolution and their faith. They felt like they had to choose between a God that is okay with the enslavement of people and what happened to their ancestors. And I don't know if we have enough time for this, but I'll go for it in 30 seconds. My name is Keron Niles. Niles is the name of my great-great-great-grandfather's slave master from Devon in England. For many of your listeners can't see me, I'm black. My ancestors were not from Devon in England. But the owners of the plantation that they were on, they were from Devon in England. Until you got captured, taken to the West Indies, and given a new name, a new first name, whatever first name you want to give you, but you got the last name of the owner, and then you got branded with an iron, and then you got sent to the plantation. That was the reality of the plantation system. What that meant is that the name that your ancestors had, all of your history, this erases all of your heritage. Because there's no way of tracking back where you were from because you don't have a name. You don't even have your language because you lost your language. And so I get questions like, how do you embrace your identity? Don't you need to change your surname? That's why Malcolm called himself Malcolm X. He rejected Poole, which was his, as he called it, slave name. And that's the essentiality of having an identity in Christ. Very practical, day to day. I'm being able to talk to students about this. I'm being able to speak about the knowledge of someone that studied slavery. And I'm not just saying my identity is in Christ, therefore slavery doesn't matter. No, slavery really matters. But that's also why my identity in Christ matters even more. Understand? Because Christ isn't ignoring the pain that we feel. And ignoring what happened also doesn't address what happened or the pain or the loss that you're experiencing losing your heritage. It's nice when you meet Europeans who have a family history of going back to, they know where their ancestors came from, where they migrated from, they can trace their name back. Same thing in the Pacific. When I went to Samoa, somebody had a tattoo on their arm that traced their family history back like 2,000 years. And I could not even fathom that. And so being able to talk to students, particularly Caribbean students, about how you can be a person of faith, as they would put it, faith in a God that enslaved your ancestors. I love those questions. And I wouldn't be in a position to answer as many of those questions as I am now if I weren't an academic. So yeah, there you go.
As always, there is so much more to say. More about the history and ongoing impact of slavery. More about climate change and the injustices attached to it. More about academic ministry. And so much more about Keron's own story. But now, to wrap it up, I asked Keron to share something that's on his heart, and then prayer requests, so we can intercede more intentionally.
Christ died for all of the world. He died for persons that we may not like. He died for persons that we love. He died for the perpetrators of slavery. He died for those that were survivors or even victims of slavery. He died for Republicans in the US. He died for Democrats. He died for persons that support the Reform Party in the UK. He died for persons that support the Labour Party. He died for you whether you're from Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar. He died for you even if you're staring down the barrel of a gun. At this point in our history, we as a planet, as a civilization, now have more wars, more conflicts than we have ever had since the end of World War II. Last time I checked, it was 56. 56 ongoing conflicts, most of them violent, with deaths ranging from dozens to hundreds of thousands. And Christ died for them all. That should break our heart every day. The things that breaks God's heart should break ours. And it does not matter what denomination you're from, who you voted for, what color your skin is, what your first language is. What matters is what he did on the cross. That's our North Star. That's the thing that unifies us. And at the end of the day, and for all of eternity, is the only thing that will ever matter. And it's the thing that we should unite around. So whether you're from Lesotho, South Africa, or Alaska, I would urge us, whether you view yourself as an Afrocentrist as I once did, whether you view yourself as a feminist, all of those ideologies are simply lens through which we view the world. I just want to encourage us as persons of faith, or as even persons that are seeking, persons that are curious, to view the world through the lens of the cross, through the lens of someone that thought that we were worth dying for and we were worth the sacrifice. What a lens it would be if we all viewed each other and the world as worthy of love to that extent. And that brings me to your second question. What should we be praying for? Peace, justice. That we view the world that we live in and its inhabitants as image bearers of God, worthy of love. And that it shapes our everyday interactions. And it shapes how we view the world, and it shapes our faith in tangible ways, more than what we see on television or hear on the news. Pray that our faith is shaped by the words of Jesus, more than the words of a news anchor, or more than the sum of our fears. That's what I would pray for. And that's what I think we should all be praying for.
You have listened to the God on the Move podcast, which is part of the Lausanne movement's wider God on the Move initiative, where we want to share inspiring God stories from the global church with the global church. Through listening to what God is doing all around the world, we hope to encourage and challenge the global church to faithful obedience to the Great Commission. So let's accelerate global mission together toward a vision for the gospel for every person, disciple-making churches for every people and place, Christ-like leaders in every church and sector, and kingdom impact in every sphere of society. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe and follow us for more.